There exists in the labyrinthine corridors of alchemical literature a figure so primal and terrifying that medieval practitioners dared not speak its name without ritual preparation. The black dragon, Draco Niger, stands as one of the most misunderstood symbols in the Western esoteric tradition, a creature that modern interpreters have reduced to metaphor, while ancient adepts understood it as an encounter with something far more immediate and dangerous, the unintegrated substrate of consciousness itself. The quest to understand this symbol begins not in dusty grimoires, but in a peculiar anxiety that haunts the threshold of genuine transformation. Every aspirant who approaches the alchemical work, whether understood literally or psychologically, eventually confronts a moment of profound resistance. It is not the resistance of doubt or intellectual skepticism, but something deeper, a visceral recoil from the dissolution of the very structures that constitute identity. The medieval alchemists, with their characteristic precision in symbolic language, encoded this encounter in the image of a dragon whose scales are blacker than night, whose breath is putrefaction, and whose domain is the prima materia, the chaotic, undifferentiated matter that precedes all form. This is not merely poetic ornamentation. The black dragon represents the psychological equivalent of confronting raw, unprocessed psychic content, the aspects of self that have never been subjected to the organizing light of consciousness. Where Jungian psychology speaks of the shadow, alchemy speaks of nigredo, the blackening, and both traditions recognize that genuine transformation cannot bypass this descent into darkness. The contemporary retreat into spiritual bypassing, the attempt to ascend without first descending, would have been recognized by medieval practitioners as a fundamental misunderstanding of the work's architecture. The significance of this symbol lies precisely in its refusal to be comfortable. The black dragon does not arrive bearing gifts of immediate enlightenment. It arrives bearing the stench of decay, the weight of historical trauma, and the chaos of unmetabolized experience. To face it is to face the primitive force that precedes all civilization, all ego structure, all carefully constructed narratives of meaning. This is the genesis of the true quest, not the search for transcendence, but the willingness to descend into the cavern where the dragon makes its lair. The philosophical architecture underlying the symbol of the black dragon rests on a principle that modern consciousness finds deeply troubling: that transformation requires not elevation, but putrefaction, not purification, but contamination with the very forces we seek to transcend. This doctrine, articulated most clearly in the Rosarium Philosophorum and echoed in the collected works of Carl Jung, proposes that consciousness emerges not from the repression of chaos, but from its deliberate engagement. In alchemical terminology, the dragon represents the mercurial principle in its most volatile state. Mercury not as the refined philosophical mercury of later operations, but as the crude poisonous quicksilver that must first be killed before it can be resurrected. This killing is not destruction, but transformation through confrontation. The alchemist does not slay the dragon from a safe distance. The work demands entering the dragon's cave, breathing its toxic fumes, and allowing oneself to be temporarily overwhelmed by its presence. Only through this seemingly suicidal encounter can the dragon's power be appropriated rather than merely suppressed. Jung's reformulation of this process in psychological terms represents not a departure from alchemical thinking, but its most rigorous translation. When Jung speaks of the shadow, those aspects of personality that consciousness rejects and projects outward, he is describing the same phenomenon the alchemists encoded in the black dragon. The shadow is not merely the repository of personal moral failures. It contains the rejected instincts, the primitive energies, the chaotic potentials that civilization and personal history have deemed unacceptable. To integrate the shadow is to recover these energies not in their raw form, but transformed through the alchemical operation of conscious attention. The central doctrine, then, is this: consciousness does not emerge from purity, but from the integration of what has been excluded. The ego, in its necessary but ultimately limiting function, establishes boundaries that protect the developing personality from overwhelming chaos. But these same boundaries, when rigidified beyond their developmental purpose, become prisons. The mature psyche requires a second movement, a deliberate loosening of boundaries, a controlled encounter with the chaos that was necessarily excluded. This is why the alchemical texts insist that the work begins with the nigredo, the blackening, the descent into the massa confusa, where all distinctions collapse. This doctrine stands in direct opposition to both naive materialism and escapist spirituality. Against materialism, it asserts that the psyche possesses depths that cannot be reduced to neurochemistry or behavioral patterns, depths that must be engaged symbolically and imaginally. Against spiritual bypassing, it insists that enlightenment without integration of the shadow produces not wisdom, but inflation, not compassion, but dissociation from the body and its instinctual life. The black dragon, properly understood, is not an obstacle to be overcome but a threshold guardian, whose very terrifying presence indicates proximity to genuine transformation. The alchemists knew what modern psychology often forgets, that the path to gold leads through lead, that the medicina of wholeness requires first the experience of dissolution, and that the philosopher's stone is forged not in the safe laboratory of the ego, but in the dangerous furnace where ego itself is volatilized. This is the architectural principle. Transformation occurs at the boundary between order and chaos, and the black dragon is the personification of that boundary. To face it is to voluntarily position oneself at the edge of psychological disintegration, not to fall into permanent madness, but to discover on the other side of temporary dissolution a more inclusive form of order. The dragon's fire does not destroy, it transmutes. But to those who have not undergone the operation, the distinction between transmutation and annihilation remains invisible, and thus the terror is absolute. The doctrine demands what most spiritual traditions only gesture toward: genuine descent before ascent, real confrontation with the repressed rather than its continued suppression, and the acceptance that consciousness expands not by reaching upward, but by deepening downward into the very material it has historically rejected. This is not a path of comfort. It is the path that the alchemists warned could drive practitioners to madness, that Jung saw lead many of his patients to the edge of psychosis, and that genuine esoteric traditions have always protected with warnings and graduated initiations. The encounter with the black dragon unfolds not as a single crisis, but as a progressive journey through distinct psychological territories, each marked by its own quality of darkness and its own mode of transformation. The alchemical texts, with their characteristic precision in symbolic language, map this journey through the sequence of operations that constitute the great work. These operations are not merely metaphorical, but describe actual stages of psychological transformation that any individual who undertakes deep interior work will inevitably traverse. The journey begins with what the alchemists called the calcinatio, the burning away of identification with surface personality. This initial stage often arrives unbidden, triggered by some life crisis that shatters the ego's carefully constructed defenses. A relationship ends, a career collapses, an illness strikes, or simply the accumulated weight of living inauthentically becomes unbearable. In this moment, the individual confronts for the first time the possibility that the self they have constructed is not adequate to the demands of existence. The black dragon appears here not as symbol, but as lived experience, a vast incomprehensible force that seems to threaten total annihilation. What distinguishes the genuine aspirant from those who retreat at this threshold is not courage in any conventional sense, but a peculiar form of philosophical curiosity. Rather than attempting to immediately rebuild the shattered structures of identity, the individual who will successfully navigate this journey asks, what if this dissolution serves a purpose? What if the terror I feel indicates not danger, but proximity to something essential? This questioning opens a space narrow and precarious for the work to begin. The second stage, the solutio, involves deliberate entry into the emotional and psychic material that the ego has historically rejected. Here the practitioner must develop what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the capacity to engage with psychic content not as literal threat, but as meaningful communication from unconscious depths. Dreams become crucial during this phase, as do synchronicities and the careful attention to fantasy and imagination. The black dragon appears in dreams not as intellectual concept, but as numinous presence, sometimes as an actual dragon, sometimes as flooding water, devouring fire, or pursuing shadow. The work requires learning to stay present with these images rather than either literalizing them into external threats or dismissing them as mere hallucination. This stage is marked by what medieval practitioners called the mortificatio, the death of the old self. Modern therapeutic language might describe this as ego death or dark night of the soul, but such terms barely capture the existential weight of the experience. The individual discovers that the personality they believe to be solid and enduring is actually a provisional construction held together by habit, social reinforcement, and fear. To release these supports is to experience genuine terror, not the adrenaline rush of physical danger, but the metaphysical vertigo of confronting the groundlessness of existence itself. Yet the alchemical tradition insists that this death is not the end, but the precondition for genuine rebirth. The texts speak of the massa confusa, the confused mass that results when all previous forms have been dissolved. This corresponds to what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious, a period when the boundaries between conscious and unconscious become permeable, when dreams bleed into waking life, when synchronicities multiply, and when the individual experiences with painful clarity the bankruptcy of their previous worldview. The critical transition comes with the recognition that the black dragon is not separate from oneself. The projection dissolves. The dragon that appeared to be an external threat reveals itself as one's own rejected psychic content, the rage that was never expressed, the grief that was never metabolized, the desires that were deemed unacceptable, the vitality that was sacrificed for social approval. This recognition does not make the dragon less terrifying. If anything, it intensifies the terror, because now there is no escape through externalization. The dragon is inside the cave, and the cave is the self. The work now enters its most demanding phase, the conjunctio, the union of opposites. The individual must find a way to contain both the conscious ego and the unconscious content symbolized by the dragon, to hold them in relationship without either being destroyed. This requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to generate symbols that unite previously irreconcilable opposites. In practical terms, this means learning to live with paradox, to maintain consciousness while allowing unconscious material to emerge, to be both disciplined and spontaneous, both structured and chaotic. The alchemical texts describe this stage through the image of the chemical wedding, the sacred marriage of king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. But these symbols can mislead contemporary readers into thinking of this as some mystical union of cosmic principles. The reality is far more mundane and far more difficult. It is the painstaking work of integrating previously split-off aspects of personality. The angry part that was rejected learns to dialogue with the compliant part. The wild instinctual self finds relationship with the civilized persona. The dragon and the knight discover they are brothers, two aspects of a single wholeness that was fragmented by developmental necessity but must now be reunited. This integration cannot be achieved through will alone. The ego, which is itself one of the split-off fragments, cannot unify what it does not contain. The texts speak of the necessity of grace, of divine intervention, of the arrival of the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, as a gift rather than an achievement. Jung translated this into psychological language by noting that the self, the totality of the psyche that transcends and includes the ego, must emerge through a process that consciousness can facilitate, but not control. The individual prepares the ground, maintains the vessel, tends the fire, but the actual transformation occurs through processes that exceed conscious intention. The final stage of this archetypal journey involves what the alchemists called the rubido, the reddening, the emergence of the solar consciousness that has integrated both light and darkness. The individual who successfully navigates this journey does not become perfect or enlightened in any supernatural sense. Rather, they become whole, capable of accessing both their heights and depths, neither identified with spiritual inflation nor collapsed into material reductionism. The black dragon has been neither killed nor exiled, but integrated as a source of power, vitality, and creative energy. This wholeness manifests not as serenity, but as a particular quality of presence, what the texts sometimes call philosophical mercury, a fluid consciousness that can move between different registers of experience without losing coherence. Such an individual can be both fierce and gentle, both decisive and receptive, both grounded in instinct and open to spirit. They have recovered what Jung called the 2-million-year-old man, the instinctual wisdom that precedes and undergirds all cultural conditioning, and integrated it with the conscious capacities that make us distinctively human. There arrives in every genuine alchemical operation a moment that the texts describe with particular precision and dread, the nigredo perfecta, the perfected blackness, when the work appears to have failed absolutely, and the practitioner confronts not merely difficulty, but the apparent annihilation of all meaning. This is the crisis that separates those who will complete the work from those who will retreat to previous certainties or collapse into cynicism. It is the moment when the black dragon reveals its most terrifying aspect, not external threat, but existential void. The crisis announces itself through a peculiar quality of despair that differs from ordinary depression or grief. Where depression often involves a heaviness, a weight that presses down, this alchemical despair involves a hollowing out, a sense that the ground itself has vanished. The individual discovers that the meaning structures they previously relied upon, religious faith, philosophical conviction, personal identity, social role, were not foundations, but temporary constructions. And now, with these constructions dissolved by the alchemical operation, there is only absence. What makes this crisis particularly dangerous is that it cannot be resolved through any of the strategies that previously worked. The ego, which typically responds to difficulty by asserting control or seeking external support, discovers that control is impossible and that no external support can address a crisis that is fundamentally ontological. Friends offer sympathy, but cannot understand the nature of the despair. Therapists provide techniques that seem absurdly inadequate to the scale of the crisis. Spiritual teachers speak of surrender and faith, but both concepts feel like cruel jokes when there is nothing to surrender to and nothing to have faith in. The alchemical texts warn explicitly about this phase. They speak of the putrefaction, the blackness blacker than black, the moment when the work appears to produce not gold but poison. Medieval practitioners sometimes added warnings to their manuscripts. Some who enter the nigredo do not return, not because they die physically, but because they become trapped in the dissolution, unable to reconstitute a viable relationship to existence. The modern equivalent would be those individuals who encounter the groundlessness of existence and remain permanently dissociated, cynical, or nihilistic, aware of the constructed nature of meaning, but unable or unwilling to participate in construction. Jung understood this crisis intimately, both from his own descent into the unconscious and from his work with patients who reach this threshold. He recognized that the confrontation with the shadow eventually leads to an even more destabilizing encounter, the recognition of the relativity of the ego itself. When the individual realizes that the I they thought they were is actually a provisional construct, maintained by selective attention and supported by consensus reality, the question becomes, if I am not this ego, then what am I? The void that opens with this question is what the mystics called the dark night, and what the alchemists symbolized as the black dragon's final test. The temptation at this stage is to make one of two catastrophic errors. The first is to retreat, to reassert the ego, to declare the entire operation a mistake, to return to the comfortable certainties that have now been revealed as illusions. This retreat produces a particular kind of bitterness, a defended knowingness that protects against further vulnerability by dismissing all depth as delusion. The second error is to collapse into the void, to embrace nihilism, to declare that since all meaning is constructed, no meaning is worth constructing. This produces either a paralyzed cynicism or a dangerous inflation, where the individual who has seen through conventional reality believes themselves to be beyond all limitation. The texts insist that there is a third possibility, but it cannot be grasped through understanding alone. This possibility requires what the alchemists called the divine water, what Jung called the symbols of transformation produced by the collective unconscious, and what phenomenology might describe as the spontaneous emergence of meaning at the limit of meaninglessness. The individual cannot will their way through this crisis, but they can maintain what the texts call the sealed vessel, the container of consciousness that neither collapses into unconsciousness nor rigidifies into defensive certainty. In practical terms, this means continuing the work even when the work appears meaningless. It means maintaining the disciplines, meditation, dream attention, creative expression, or whatever practices have been established, not because they promise results, but because the maintenance itself becomes a form of faith without content. The practitioner tends the fire not knowing if transmutation will occur, but recognizing that the tending itself is the only authentic response to the crisis. What gradually emerges for those who can sustain this position is a subtle shift in the quality of the despair. The void that initially appeared as pure negation begins to reveal itself as generative potential. The absence of predetermined meaning becomes the freedom to participate in meaning-making. The groundlessness that threatened annihilation becomes the openness that allows genuine novelty. The black dragon, which seemed to represent only destruction, reveals itself as the prima materia, the raw material of consciousness itself, which can be shaped but never exhausted. This is the great secret that the alchemical tradition protected, that the void is not empty, or rather it is empty of predetermined content but full of potential. The crisis of the soul resolves not when meaning is recovered, but when the individual discovers their capacity to participate in the ongoing creation of meaning. Not to create meaning arbitrarily, as if it were mere fantasy, but to recognize themselves as the site where meaning and meaninglessness meet and generate genuine novelty. The individual who successfully navigates the encounter with the black dragon does not emerge unchanged. This much is obvious. What remains less obvious, and what the alchemical tradition emphasizes with particular care, is the specific quality of the transformation that occurs. The result is not enlightenment in any conventional spiritual sense, not perfection, not the transcendence of human limitation. Rather, it is a reconfigured relationship to the totality of existence, what Jung called individuation, and what the alchemists symbolized as the creation of the philosopher's stone. The first and most striking characteristic of this transformation is a peculiar form of sovereignty. The individual who has integrated the black dragon, who has descended into the prima materia and reconstituted themselves from that encounter, no longer requires external validation in the same way. This is not the false sovereignty of narcissism or inflation, which actually depends desperately on external confirmation. Rather, it is a quiet confidence rooted in the knowledge that one has faced the worst, the dissolution of identity itself, and survived. Not survived intact, but survived through transformation. This sovereignty manifests as an increased capacity to tolerate ambiguity and paradox. Where previously the individual might have sought refuge in ideological certainty or rigid identity, they now recognize that all frameworks are provisional, all identities are performed, and all meanings are constructed. But crucially, this recognition does not lead to nihilism. Instead, it produces a kind of playful seriousness, the ability to commit fully to chosen meanings while remaining aware of their constructed nature. The alchemists called this the achievement of philosophical mercury, a consciousness that is simultaneously fluid and coherent. The second characteristic involves a transformation in the relationship to the instinctual life. The black dragon, as symbol of the rejected primitive forces, contains not only shadow elements that must be confronted, but also vital energies that consciousness requires. The individual who has integrated these forces discovers a renewed connection to the body, to spontaneity, to creative impulse. They become less controlled and more vital, less defended, and more genuinely present. This is what the texts mean by the restoration of the philosophical gold, not some supernatural substance, but the recovery of the natural vitality that civilization and neurosis had suppressed. Practically, this integration often manifests as increased creative capacity. The individual who was previously blocked, unable to write, paint, think originally, or act decisively, discovers a renewed flow of energy and imagination. This is not because they have learned new techniques, but because they have removed the internal obstacles that were diverting psychic energy into repression and defense. The alchemical operation, in this sense, is not additive but subtractive. It removes the false structures that were blocking the natural expression of the self. The third characteristic, and perhaps the most important, involves a shift from power dynamics to what might be called participatory consciousness. Before the integration, the individual's relationship to both the external world and the internal psyche was characterized by attempts at domination. The ego trying to control unconscious contents, the will trying to force outcomes, consciousness trying to master existence. After the integration, a different mode emerges. The individual learns to work with rather than against, to participate in processes rather than control them, to serve the self rather than inflate the ego. This participatory consciousness produces what Jung called the religious attitude, not religiosity in any doctrinal sense, but a fundamental posture of respect toward the mystery of existence. The individual who has encountered the black dragon and survived knows with a knowing that transcends intellectual understanding that consciousness emerges from depths it cannot fully comprehend and participates in processes it cannot fully control. This knowledge produces a kind of existential humility that coexists paradoxically with the sovereignty mentioned earlier. The final integration manifests as a capacity to serve as what the alchemists called a vessel, or what depth psychology might describe as a container for transformation. The individual who has undergone the work becomes capable of holding space for others who are undergoing similar processes, not through giving advice or sharing techniques, but through the quality of their presence. They can witness another's dissolution without rushing to fix it, can tolerate another's darkness without being contaminated by it, and can offer the kind of steady attention that the alchemical operation requires. This is why the alchemical tradition insisted that the work was ultimately in service of something larger than personal transformation. The philosopher's stone, once created, becomes a catalyst, a substance that can transform base metal into gold without itself being consumed. The individual who has integrated the black dragon becomes a transformative presence in the world, not through preaching or teaching in any conventional sense, but through the simple fact of their existence as a demonstration that the work is possible. The result, then, is not a final state, but an ongoing process. The integration of the shadow, the metabolization of the prima materia, the creation of the philosophical stone, these are not achievements that, once completed, remain static. Rather, they inaugurate a new mode of being characterized by continuous transformation, deepening relationship with the unconscious, and expanding capacity to participate in the larger patterns of existence. The black dragon, once faced and integrated, becomes not a vanquished enemy but an ally, the source of the very power that allows consciousness to continually renew and deepen itself. The gold you seek is not found in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the fire.